This talk is about the biology of southern pine bark beetles. There's five main species or five species of southern pine bark beetles that we're concerned about, and that's Dendroctonus frontalis, the infamous southern pine beetle, Dendroctonus terebrans, black turpentine beetle, and then three species of Ips, Ipsivalsis, grandicoleus, and calligraphus. So you can see here the relative size of black turpentine beetle to a grain of rice, and then southern pine beetle. And so black turpentine beetle is the largest beetle. And in this figure you can see the black turpentine beetle is usually going to be to the bottom, restricted to the bottom 10 feet. And really it's not going to really kill trees very often. So it's really not a major concern in terms of killing trees. Now southern pine beetle and then the three species of Ips, they can kill trees, particularly southern pine beetle, both healthy and low vigor trees. And Ips will attack low vigor trees. But the three species of Ips, Valsis is usually at the top, and it can often be found in branches, smaller branches, and grandicoleus is in the middle, and it can be found in bigger branches, and then calligraphus generally is going to be on the bottom part of the tree. So the pine beetle can be across the whole stem. And here's a picture of an Ips beetle. So this is a five-spined Ips, Ips grandicoleus. So my understanding is this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spines. And Ips is going to differ from Dendroctonus in several ways, but this way Ips is going to have these spines, and it's going to have this little hollowed out or depressed rear end, or you could say. And where the Dendroctonus are going to be smooth. And here you can see this is a 6 spine. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spines on the back of Ips. And notice it looks like it's almost kind of, when you see from this point of view, it looks like it's almost the rear ends have been chewed off or something's taken them out, whereas the Dendroctonus are smooth. And here's another picture just showing the relative size of these beetles to a dime. And there's a fourth species in the southeast, Ips, that's mainly just in Appalachia. And then the red turpentine beetle is also in Appalachia, and it's another Dendroctonus. Other beetles that can be are a concern, the main ones are pine sorrel beetle and ambrosia beetles, but these, as far as I know, they don't kill trees directly. These are usually going to come on the back end. And then the southern pine sawyer, if you've ever seen one, they're kind of scary looking. They'll have these little like V-shaped hollows in the bark of the tree. And then the checkered beetle or clarid beetle, these are actually a predator of Ips and southern pine beetle. So they are actually beneficial to us, and they'll usually, my understanding, they'll come in after the tree has died, and when the newly developed adults from the larvae, pupae, and the adults from the initial infestation, when they're coming out of the tree, these clarid beetles, Ips and southern pine beetles, when they're coming out, these checkered beetles, clarid beetles will eat them. So they're a natural predator. Just in general, normally we think of Ips infestations as a few trees here or there. Ips are only going to attack low vigor trees. So they attack a tree that's low vigor, and then they're only going to attack another tree that's also low vigor. So usually they're constrained to 2 to 5 trees. Normally we don't pay a whole lot of attention to them, particularly in a forested setting. This past year, though, during the drought, because of the excessive drought, there were some spots with 20 or 50 trees, and I've even heard of 2 or 3 acres being killed by Ips, so very rare. Now, southern pine beetle can be devastating. It can destroy thousands of acres, but it has this initial, I guess, spot, and it comes out and it kind of goes in a direction. So Ips will kind of be here and there and everywhere. Southern pine beetle differs from Ips in that it can attack healthy trees when the numbers get large in mass, whereas Ips will only attack unhealthy low vigor trees. Southern pine beetle, once they get going, they'll actually kill healthy trees. So they kind of have this direction. So they'll kill all these trees in an area. Where exactly the initial spot is, it could have been back there. You'll have this initial yellowing of the initial infestation, then it'll kind of move, and you'll get a yellowing, and then kind of a lighter green at the front end, and then kind of in the back end here as it's moving, this will turn red, then they'll turn brown, and then they'll be completely defoliated. And they can obviously destroy thousands of acres. So they are very destructive. Here's a drawing. So here's the original spot, and you can see they're going to move in a direction, unlike Ips that kind of jump around into little pockets here or there, normally at least. Southern pine beetle will have this progression, and then they'll come to these trees and infest them, and I believe have a generation there, and then they'll move to the next tree and so forth, and then the initial crown yellowing, and then here's the fresh attack, and so it's moving this way. That's why I'm not going to get much into this, but a control is to come on the front end of that direction and then cut the trees into that pile to keep these trees from being infested by the blue trees. Actually, southern pine beetles are relatively rare, and generally their numbers are low, with the exception of when you have these massive outbreaks. And depending on the source, around 15 to 25% of attacked trees really don't result in massive outbreaks. They don't expand to 20 trees or more. So there's really not that high of a number when they do expand. But when they do expand, they can be devastating. So of course we had that historic drought during summer 2023, and this just created a perfect habitat for Ips, particularly, but also southern pine beetle. And so we basically had no rain from July 16th to November 10th, at least in Crystal Springs, southwest Mississippi at least. I'm mainly talking everybody. And then excessive temperatures exceeding 90 degrees, a total of 70 days from basically that same range as well. So you're combining those two, and then of course you had major droughts later in the year, September, October, November. That's when the beetles are most active, usually from 60 to 90 degrees or 60 to 95 degrees is when the beetles are most active. And then, of course, that drought situation just created perfect habitat for them. Now, this is from March 14th, the rain that we've had, so hopefully that's going to help us going forward into 2024. Basically, I'm not saying we're in an excessive amount of water, but at least we're no longer in a drought in the whole southwest region. So all 5 of these beetles are going to initiate an attack because of a low vigor, some stress to a pine tree. And Ips, as I mentioned, are notoriously known for only attacking low vigor, stressed pine trees. They can also live and, I guess you could say, infest logging slabs. So what does low vigor or stressed mean in a tree? Well, think of yourself, right? Anything that can lower your defenses, your immune system, it's going to make you more susceptible to illness. Same thing with trees. Anything that can reduce their ability to their health, their tree physiology, water movement, nutrients, food production, their sugars, right? Anything that can disrupt that, it's going to result in some loss of vigor, making them more susceptible to variety of things, particularly like Ips and southern pine beetles. Now remember, black turpentine beetle can also infest, but usually it doesn't infest at the numbers enough to kill the tree. So we're mainly concerned about Ips and southern pine beetles. So anything like stem system or any damage to the stem or root, like even things like parking on these roots for months or years is going to impact those trees. Diseased trees, right? Damage from high winds or hurricanes or ice storms. Lightning strikes, too intense of prescribed burns, or even wildfires, and intense competition because of overstand density. And that's where you get a lot of these attacks, everybody, from southern pine beetle. It's just an excessive amount of stand density. So that's, of course, where you see a lot of them are by the national forest, because those are trees are usually older age, right? They're gonna, older you get, normally you're gonna be a little more stressed, and you have excessive amount of density. Too much competition for more, nutrients and light, but particularly moisture in the middle of that drought. And of course, droughts are going to create habitat for these beetles. So I like this table and I like this publication, but I wish it was the other way around. This is tolerance. I'd rather see susceptibility. But generally, we think of slash and longleaf being more tolerant, less susceptible to southern pine beetle and Ips because of a higher resin content relative to shortleaf and loblolly. And then this is your black turpentine beetle. Ips and SPB are similar, once again, in that both of them are going to take advantage of low vigor trees. But southern pine beetle differs from Ips, or Ips differs from southern pine beetle, and that any new tree it's only going to attack is another low vigor tree. So normally it's only going to pick out little pockets, 2 to 5 trees of low vigor trees, and it's not going to attack the rest of the trees because they're too healthy to fight off the beetles. Whereas SPB, once they get in mass, they can come through and kill healthy trees, and so therefore they can take over they can destroy large areas. In all 5 of these, the 3 ips and the 2 Dendroctonus, including the black turpentine beetle and southern pine beetle, they live predominantly in the inner bark. Now what is that? They feed and breed and feed on the phloem tissue. You see some different definitions sometimes, but here's the bark and then the phloem on the inside, just right inside of the bark, and then you have the wood, and right in that area, just right inside of the bark, is probably the easiest way to think of it in the cambium. So for ips beetles, the initial attack and host selection of individual tree results from a male beetle flying to a tree and boring into the bark. For southern pine beetle and black turpentine beetle, Dendroctonus, right, ips genus and Dendroctonus genus, the female is going to be the host selection and initiate the attack. So once these trees find some tree, and I believe that these trees must emit some kind of attractant, a pheromone, that somehow they sense that. So once they come to the tree, then there's a battle between the tree and the beetle. And so the beetle is going to try to get into the tree, and then that's where you get these pitch tubes, because once the beetle bores into the tree has this pitch or resin. It's going to push out the beetle. And now, once, like in an excessive amount of drought, that's the problem that we had this past year, particularly related to ips and it just being an excessive amount of infestations. Not a lot of resin, not a lot of pressure of the resin to push the beetle out because the excessive amount of drought, the low vigor, the low health of the tree. And so this is going to produce your popcorn. Here's an example where a beetle lost. So the beetle lost, the tree pushed it out. And I didn't see a whole lot of those this past year. Actually, this is probably the only one that I saw, really. Of all the trees that I've seen, that just tells you the drought. Here's an example, I think, of where a beetle got in. And then, of course, it's going to initiate the infestation or the attack. Black turpentine beetle is going to have a bigger pitch tube, like a quarter. And I would say the ips and southern pine beetle are going to be about a dime. Ips is going to be more on the bark platelets, and southern pine beetle is going to be more on the bark crevices. So for ips, often the tree is low enough vigor that a male beetle is going to chew in through the bark and get into the phloem. And then once the beetle gets in there, he's going to emit an attractant. And I believe this is ipsinol, ipstanol, and cisverbinol. They're also going to be mixed with some kind of pheromone or kind of a smell put off by the trees themselves. And that's going to call female ips and other male ips to the tree. And so therefore these beetles can overwhelm the tree's defenses. Then the male is going to mate with 1 to 7 females, generally 3 in this nuptial chamber. And then after that, the female is going to chew through this egg gallery, through the phloem, is going to chew an egg gallery. Southern pine beetle, the female initiates attack. And once she gets in there, she's going to release an attractant frontalin, and that'll bring males and other females to the tree. And then I think the males release an attractant called indobrevicum, although some people say it's a dispellant or a kind of an anti-aggregation. And once again, the beetles can overwhelm the tree's defense. And I'm not exactly sure, but I think a female only mates with 1 male. But once again, you guys notice here the chewed off end of the ips and the smooth round end of the Dendroctonus frontalis southern pine beetle. So after they mate for ips, the female then chews these vertical galleries, and they're very distinctive. They extend away. As far as I know, these are free of boring dust and frats, but you'll see this kind of this I, H, or X from these nuptial chambers going up vertically. And she'll deposit her eggs in those egg galleries. And here's an example, everybody. You can see the vertical. This is actually Ips grandicoleus, and this is Ips avulsus. It has these little pits. It's a little bit different, but still, nonetheless, it's on the inside of the bark going up. And here's the larval tunnels, and I'll talk about that here shortly. Similarly, southern pine beetle, but the female here is going to go off, and it just kind of has this serpentine kind of, there's no real rhyme or reason to it. It kind of goes everywhere, the spaghetti-like splatter appearance. And I think the male follows the female, and it actually moves frass and packs it. So the Ips adult female doesn't have frass, but the southern pine beetle will in their galleries, and you can definitely see a difference. There's no vertical trend to it like Ips, and so the SPB female will also lay eggs in those galleries. Then they carry, the female Ips and SPB carry a blue stain fungus, and then there's some, maybe another fungus for southern pine beetle. Is the blue stain good to the pine beetle or not? There's some, I think we're still figuring things out, but for the most part we feel it provides a food source for the larvae. So once the female is chewing through the phloem, as it's depositing its eggs, it's carrying with this blue stain with it, and then as the larvae grow, the blue stain is going with the larva, and it feeds on them. And then the blue stain can also get in the xylem, and the xylem is kind of the inner part, kind of the wood part, not the heartwood because that's dead, but kind of this in part, and it'll get in there, and so that'll restrict water movement up the tree, and I think that's why initially you'll see a yellowing of the crown. So if the phloem, the beetles themselves, if they don't kill the tree through the phloem, kind of halting, kind of girdling the tree, halting or stopping the movement of sugars and nutrients for energy, then the xylem, the plugging up of the xylem with the moisture will kill the tree. So as far as I know, once you get beetles, whether southern pine beetle or Ips, into a tree, there's nothing you can do to cure it. So then, once the tree is overwhelmed, and at what point is it kind of dead or not exactly, and mating is going on, then I believe the males exclusively will emit a pheromone, an anti-attractant called verbenone. And this verbenone then tells other beetles that were coming to the tree from the attractants like phentalin or ipstanol, it's now telling them no, go to another tree. But that's why if you remember, if you've seen these verbenone pouches, people say that you can put them up on trees, or this liquid splat with verbenone that may kind of artificially tell beetles not to come to the tree. So then the larva, right? So you have the female egg galleries, and she lays eggs on both sides, and then the larva hatch. And you can see this is Ips avulsus, this is Ips granicoleus, and they're perpendicular to the vertical on the Ips. And also they're kind of perpendicular on the southern pine beetle. This says the southern pine beetle, but that, nonetheless though, they're perpendicular to the female feeding galleries. And you can see that as they get bigger, as they get further away, in Ips, they get bigger as they get further away. Well, that's because the larvae is getting larger with age. And then Ips avulsus is very unique. It has these little pits, not pitch pockets, but pits, and that's where the larvae pupate, and then they eventually become an adult. And so the Ips avulsus is very unique, but nonetheless they'll have these, at the end of these galleries is where these beetles pupate, the larvae pupate, and then they'll become adults. And so then here's an Ips beetle, and it has the egg, and then I think 3 instars for the larva. It pupates, and then it becomes an adult. Notice once again, you guys, the rear end looks like it's chewed off. And then they'll fly away once they become an adult. And here's the Ips avulsus again. This is where the larvae come out of, right? The southern pine beetle and Ips avulsus differ from calligraphus and granicoleus in that they have shorter galleries, larva galleries shorter, and Ips avulsus has these pits. Once they adult, they merge through the bark. Here's Ips avulsus and Ips calligraphus. Notice Ips avulsus is the smallest beetle of the Ips, and it's not maybe the scale necessarily, but the Ips calligraphus has bigger emergence holes, and then they'll fly away to the new tree. So development's usually slower in cool temperatures, and so usually these beetles can, and the cool temperatures are often associated with more moisture. Remember, so the trees are going to have a higher vigor. So therefore development's going to be a little slower in those situations. And I think maybe even the colder winter may even internally kind of slow the beetles down. So they're most active from about 60 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Calligraphus, and grandicoleus and southern pine beetle can complete their life cycles in about 25 days, so around 6 to 8 generations for the two Ips, and 7 to 9 for southern pine beetle. You can have that depending once again on the weather. Cooler temperatures and more moisture may result in fewer generations. Then Ips avulsus can take as little as 18 days, producing up to 10 generations per year. And usually after initial infestation, the tree mortality will occur in about 4 to 6 weeks after you see noticeable symptoms. And then, of course, you have this whole generation being developed into that individual tree. Thank you.